This is the gospel the church never wanted you to read. A forgotten manuscript pulled from desert soil, a name carved into its fragile pages, and a version of Judas that looks nothing like the villain we were taught. In this video, you'll uncover the 1,700-year-old text that turns the most hated traitor in history into the only disciple who truly understood Jesus. A gospel so disruptive it was hidden, damaged, traded, restored, and quietly examined by experts close to the Vatican. And I've spent months digging through its fragments to understand why. But the most dangerous part isn't what it says about Judas. It's the secret teaching at the very end, the one that made this gospel too explosive to survive. The story begins where time holds its breath, the desert cliffs of Egypt, a place where sand can preserve a papyrus longer than the kingdoms that once ruled beneath it. But what happened in the 1970s looked nothing like archaeology. It began with chance, or at least that's the official line. Local diggers searching for items to sell uncovered a sealed limestone box, untouched and heavy, shaped like those used for ancient monastic or funerary texts. Inside lay a bound papyrus codex, so old its binding cracked the moment it was exposed to air. What should have followed was routine. Report the find, document it, stabilize it. Instead, the codex slipped immediately into the shadows of the antiquities market, where relics move through whispers and cash, not records. Historians later noted how fast it vanished from official sight, a disappearance that set the tone for everything that came after. Once a manuscript enters that underground network, preservation becomes secondary, and its fate depends entirely on whoever happens to hold it next. From there, the codex endured a slow, disastrous journey. Dealers interested in profit, not conservation, wrapped it poorly, exposed it to humidity, and passed it around with little understanding of its fragility. Conservators who later inspected it saw the damage instantly: dried fibers, ink lifting from the surface, edges worn by careless handling. Then its trajectory grew even more erratic. After circulating through several intermediaries, it was stashed in a bank vault, then in a wooden crate, and eventually in the damp corner of a basement. But the worst blow came when a dealer, convinced cold would preserve it, placed the manuscript inside a household freezer. Moisture trapped in the fibers expanded and ruptured the ink, causing entire sections to shatter into flakes no larger than dust. Damage that should have taken centuries unfolded in a matter of years. As the codex deteriorated, access narrowed. It eventually ended up with a Swiss collector whose identity remains partly obscured. Those who traced its path describe him as cautious and distrustful, unwilling to involve museums or scholars. He demanded a price so high that major institutions stepped back, yet he kept the manuscript locked away for nearly 2 decades. In that isolation, it darkened, dried, warped, and grew mold, an artifact slowly collapsing in silence. Why someone who valued it so fiercely refused to protect it remains unclear. Some specialists believe he feared disappointing authentication. Others thought he suspected the text carried sensitive implications. What is certain is that he avoided the very experts who could have stabilized it. Meanwhile, interest continued to grow quietly. Through the 1980s and 1990s, academics and private foundations attempted to see or acquire the codex. Negotiations unfolded behind closed doors. Intermediaries shifted constantly. Scholars who heard rumors were advised to stay silent, an unusual level of caution in a field eager to publicize discoveries. That secrecy alone hinted that the manuscript might contain something far more consequential than its crumbling pages suggested. When specialists finally managed to examine fragments, the first signs of its nature emerged. Even in broken lines, the name Judas appeared repeatedly, not in accusation, but in contexts suggesting trust, conversation, and closeness. Those trained in Coptic recognized faint patterns that pointed toward a gospel narrative, one that felt entirely unlike the canonical tradition. The impression was fragile, drawn from scattered phrases, yet deeply unsettling. A gospel that portrayed Judas without hostility could shift one of the most emotionally charged stories in Christian memory. A pattern began to reveal itself. Ordinary manuscripts move freely through academic channels. They are photographed, catalogued, studied. This one moved as if radioactive, hidden, mishandled, and treated with unusual caution. If it had been a simple theological curiosity, it would have settled quietly into a collection. Instead, it hovered for decades in a limbo between concealment and pursuit. By the early 2000s, when conservators finally gained legitimate access, they were not just restoring a manuscript, they were untangling a long chain of evasion. Pages had shattered from freezing, mold had consumed lines, fragments had been lost or dispersed. The codex bore the scars of age, but also the consequences of every misguided hand that touched it. And as you trace its path, from desert cliffs to smugglers' routes, from freezers to private vaults, the same quiet question rises again and again. Why was this manuscript treated as something to be hidden, not studied? What did they fear was written inside? Those unanswered questions mark the threshold to the next chapter, because once the surviving lines were finally reconstructed, the nature of its danger became unmistakable. The text didn't simply reinterpret a disciple, it challenged the foundation of a story, repeated for nearly 2,000 years. And that undercurrent of disruption, present long before a full translation existed, is what finally drew the codex out of the shadows and into an unsettling light. You're stepping now into the part of the story where the manuscript stops behaving like an archaeological curiosity and becomes something far more destabilizing. Because once conservators pieced together enough fragments to read continuous lines, scholars began seeing patterns they never expected, patterns that challenged the most familiar villain in Western memory. What emerged didn't feel like a forgotten gospel rediscovered. It felt like a quiet explosion beneath 2 millennia of Christian imagination. The first shock comes from the portrait of Jesus. In these reconstructed passages, he does not speak like the teacher of the canonical Gospels. His voice moves through layered metaphors, cosmic hierarchies, and secret instruction. The tone resembles a master addressing an initiate, one chosen for insight, while the others remain bound to misunderstanding. The manuscript establishes, almost rhythmically, a distinction between those who hear parables and the one who receives knowledge. And from that foundation, everything else shifts. Because Judas in these pages is nothing like the figure carried through centuries of liturgy and art. Scholars note how often he appears alone with Jesus, more than any other disciple, and how these dialogues lack accusation or tension. Jesus identifies him as the only one capable of understanding the deeper mission he is about to fulfill. When Jesus speaks of cosmic realms, of the flawed material world, of the necessity of leaving the physical body behind, Judas responds not with confusion, but with comprehension. That alone places this gospel outside anything else in the early Christian archive. But the text goes further. In several passages, Jesus tells Judas he will surpass the others, a phrase scholars read as reassurance and prophecy. Within the internal logic of the manuscript, Judas is not singled out for betrayal, but for completing the act necessary for Jesus to shed the human form and return to the divine realm. Here, betrayal becomes obedience, and obedience becomes the key step in a spiritual transition. The disciple condemned for centuries emerges as the only one who truly understood. The contrast becomes sharper when you look at how the gospel treats the remaining disciples. Far from pillars of understanding, they appear trapped in earthly thinking, misinterpreting rituals, clinging to literal expectations, circling around meanings they cannot grasp. Their perspective forms the very tradition that later became mainstream Christianity. If Judas is the enlightened one, and the others misunderstand the message, then the foundations of that tradition rest on the interpretations of those who never grasped the deeper teaching. Historical context gives the manuscript even more weight. Linguistic and stylistic analysis places its ideas in the 2nd century, a a turbulent moment when early Christian groups fiercely debated how to interpret Jesus' death and the meaning of discipleship. In that landscape, a gospel portraying Judas as the chosen instrument fits perfectly, but it also collides directly with the narrative that eventually won the historical contest. That collision explains why the manuscript feels radical even today. It preserves a voice from a version of Christianity that lost, but never lost its power to unsettle. The imagery deepens the disruption. In several passages, Jesus laughs at the disciples' misunderstanding, a detail that startled scholars because it reveals a clear distance between divine awareness and human expectation. But with Judas, the tone changes. The laughter disappears. The instructions sharpen. The metaphors become clearer. Early Christian historians recognize this as a literary signal of intimacy used to identify a favored disciple. And in this text, that intimacy rests entirely with Judas, which naturally leads to a question scholars still debate. If Judas acted in obedience, what becomes of the entire moral structure built around betrayal, guilt, and repentance? Within the Gospel's worldview, the act labeled as treachery becomes the doorway to transcendence. Jesus speaks of discarding the physical body like a garment. Judas enables the transition. Without a traitor, the emotional arc of the Passion changes shape, and doctrines rooted in the contrast between loyalty and treason lose their anchor. This matters deeply because religious traditions rely on emotional constancy. Peter as the rock, John as the beloved, Judas as the betrayer. These roles stabilize centuries of sermons, paintings, rituals, and storytelling, all to one, and the emotional equilibrium of the entire narrative shifts. The Gospel of Judas doesn't just alter the figure of Judas, it uproots him entirely. A condemnation becomes comprehension, a kiss becomes a signal agreed upon, and Jesus appears not as a victim of betrayal, but as the architect of a necessary transition. For those who first read the manuscript, this was the true shock, not its theology, but its emotional inversion. A story without a villain loses its moral contrast. And without moral contrast, believers must reconsider what redemption, sacrifice, and sin mean when the categories are no longer stable. By the end of this section, the implications become unavoidable. A gospel where Jesus designates Judas as the disciple who knows destabilizes the inherited idea of discipleship. A narrative where betrayal is obedience redefines the meaning of sacrifice, and a text built on secret knowledge challenges traditions shaped by public proclamation. It's a reminder that early Christianity was never a single voice, but a landscape of competing visions, each confident it carried the truth. And that competition leads directly to the next chapter. Because once a text like this exists, authentic, ancient, and radically divergent, it inevitably draws the attention of those invested in preserving doctrinal continuity. The question is not why scholars examined it, but who else read it in silence, and what their silence reveals. You're entering the part of the story where silence speaks louder than publication, where institutions that usually communicate through official statements begin operating through private readers, discreet consultations, and conversations that leave no trace. By the time scholars outside Egypt had reconstructed enough of the Codex to grasp its age and theological weight, word had already travelled into places where texts are not simply studied, but evaluated for their consequences. And although the Vatican never issued a public declaration, you can see the outline of its interest in the specialists who appeared around the manuscript, the questions they asked, and the precautions they took. The first hints emerge from the movement of the fragments. Scholars familiar with Coptic manuscripts recall that portions of the Codex reached individuals with long-standing ties to Vatican-affiliated institutions. These weren't random academics. They were figures whose careers bridged historical research and ecclesiastical preservation. Their role was not to authenticate a relic for devotion, but to determine whether the manuscript fit within the known landscape of early Christian diversity, a process deeply rooted in Catholic scholarship, private evaluation, measured commentary, and careful separation between historical relevance and doctrinal authority. As these readers examined the codex, they confirmed what linguistic and paleographic analysis had already suggested. The manuscript belonged to the 2nd century. That alone made it significant. It wasn't a medieval invention or a later forgery. It was a voice from the era when Christian identity was still fluid and fiercely contested, and that realization created a quiet tension. Fragments from that period carry historical weight because they preserve interpretations circulating near the origins of the movement. A gospel that elevated Judas within that early framework wasn't just unusual, it was a reminder that perspectives now considered heterodox once existed alongside those that became orthodoxy. You see the consequences of this recognition in the way Catholic scholars handled the text. They analyzed its cosmology, its imagery, its dialogue structure, and the spiritual universe it described. Much of it matched known Gnostic ideas, traditions that emphasized inner knowledge over external ritual. Historically, this made perfect sense. Doctrinally, it posed a delicate challenge. The Church has long acknowledged the existence of Gnostic writings, while sharply distinguishing them from canonical scripture. But this gospel touched a nerve because it reinterpreted a figure central to Christian morality. Judas, long cast as the embodiment of betrayal, suddenly positioned as obedient. This is where internal debate emerged. Scholars approaching the text historically acknowledged its importance without hesitation. Those attuned to pastoral or doctrinal impact saw something more troubling. If Judas's action was not treachery but cooperation, then the emotional structure of the Passion narrative shifted. The themes of failure, remorse, and redemption, central to sermons, rituals, and centuries of art, lost their familiar shape. A reversal of that magnitude couldn't be easily absorbed into traditional teaching. You can sense this tension in the way certain experts spoke publicly. They emphasized the Gospel's age, its Gnostic background, and its usefulness for understanding early Christian plurality. Everything they said was true, but they avoided the deeper implication. If Jesus and Judas acted in concert, the drama of moral collapse evaporates, and without that drama, the clarity of the redemption arc becomes harder to maintain. It wasn't theology that felt threatened, it was the emotional logic that underpins how believers have understood the crucifixion for centuries. The timing of the manuscript's appearance amplified the caution. It surfaced during a surge of public fascination with alternative Christian histories, after discoveries like Nag Hammadi and the Dead Sea Scrolls had already captured global imagination. Institutions responsible for preserving doctrinal heritage move carefully when sensational interpretations risk drowning out sober scholarship. A gospel that reframed Judas could easily be misread as an official challenge to long-standing belief, even if scholars framed it merely as a window into early Christian diversity. The risk of misunderstanding often influences silence as much as doctrinal boundaries do. But silence was not disinterest. The involvement of Vatican-connected scholars in the early examinations shows an awareness that the text needed to be understood before entering public discourse. Their evaluations helped define its boundaries: ancient, authentic, heterodox, and symbolically provocative. They recognized that its portrayal of Jesus as a revealer of hidden realms aligned with Gnostic cosmologies. They saw that its structure echoed other second-century dialogues. They noted that its elevation of Judas fit a worldview where insight held greater value than obedience to earthly authority. And in recognizing these traits, they also recognized how sharply the manuscript diverged from the narratives that shaped mainstream Christian identity. This divergence is where institutional caution crystallizes. The gospel didn't threaten doctrine directly. No one suggested it could or should enter the canon. Its worldview lay outside the theological framework established long ago, but it threatened something subtler. the emotional stability of a story nearly every Christian knows. The Church can acknowledge historical variation without difficulty. What it cannot easily accommodate is a narrative that encourages believers to reinterpret the moral categories embedded in the Passion. And the Gospel of Judas does exactly that. It recasts the figure synonymous with betrayal as the disciple who understood the divine plan most clearly. If you examine the public statements that eventually emerged, a pattern appears. Church scholars stressed context. They highlighted the Gospel's Gnostic roots. They discussed the plurality of early Christianity. All of this served to anchor the conversation, to prevent sensationalism, to keep the focus historical rather than devotional. But beneath the measured tone lies the recognition that the Gospel's portrait of Judas disrupts the moral clarity that has structured Christian imagination for 2 millennia. By this point in the story, the Vatican's role becomes less about intervention and more about framing. Its scholars helped situate the Gospel historically and theologically, ensuring its significance wasn't inflated or misunderstood. They understood its value for understanding early Christian diversity. They also understood its potential to spark confusion if interpreted without context. Their silence was not suppression. It was the acknowledgement that historical documents are not doctrinal guides. What remains unresolved is the gap between what was examined privately and what was addressed publicly. Scholars confirmed the Gospel's antiquity, its surprising narrative, its theological audacity, yet the institution avoided the one question that grants the manuscript its power. If Judas acted according to Jesus' instruction, what becomes of the traditional understanding of betrayal? That unanswered question leads directly into the next stage of the story. Because while institutions approached the text with caution, individuals outside those walls were far less restrained, and their competing claims, mistranslations, and fragment disputes would soon ignite a struggle that revealed just how volatile a damaged manuscript could become. By now, you've seen how the manuscript slipped through deserts, vaults, and quiet reading rooms. But once it entered the hands of conservators and rival scholars, the struggle around it changed completely. What had begun as secrecy driven by collectors and caution from institutions became an open contest, a clash between academics, dealers, foundations, and translators, each convinced they alone should rescue, publish, or control the Gospel of Judas. And the manuscript, fragile as ash and older than most empires, became the center of a conflict that nearly destroyed it a second time. The shift became obvious the moment conservators unwrapped the codex in the early 2000s. Papyrus should bend slightly when handled. This one cracked like a dry leaf. Ink lifted at the slightest vibration. Edges had turned to powder. Even specialists paused before touching it, realizing the damage done by decades of freezing, humidity, and constant movement. They began the painstaking work, flattening pages, humidifying fibers, aligning fragments, using infrared imaging to recover letters invisible to the eye. But as restoration became possible, a new problem surfaced: competing claims over who had the right to oversee, translate, or publish the text. The tension grew when scholars realized pieces of the codex had circulated independently years earlier. Some remembered seeing photographs of pages no longer present. Others recalled rumors of fragments, sold quietly to private buyers. This wasn't speculation. Experts recognized the pattern. In the antiquities market, pages often vanish, torn out as samples, sold individually, misplaced by handlers who don't understand their significance. And because the codex had been frozen and thawed repeatedly, many sections had already disintegrated before any academic ever saw them. A mix of opportunism and decay had created gaps no restoration could fill. Those gaps sparked the next battle: translation. Scholars working from the surviving fragments produced early drafts, but their interpretations were immediately challenged. Some argued the grammar had been rendered too generously, smoothing ambiguities to make the gospel appear more coherent than the fragments allowed. Others accuse drafts of leaning toward theological conclusions not fully supported by the text. A few claimed excitement over the Judas narrative had colored the translator's judgment. The restored pages themselves explain the disputes. Many lines were incomplete, forcing scholars to reconstruct missing letters using parallels from other Coptic works. In any text, this would be delicate. In one as charged as the Gospel of Judas, every choice carried enormous weight. A single reconstructed verb could suggest obedience instead of betrayal. One missing clause could change the tone of a conversation between Jesus and Judas. Translation became detective work, and wherever evidence was thin, disagreement sharpened. These debates spilled out of the restoration room and into conferences, journals, and private emails. Some academics accused the restoration team of restricting access. Others believed rivals tried to discredit the project to claim control of future research. Letters circulated describing fragments in private hands. Dealers hinted they had once handled pages that never reached conservators. Collectors recalled being shown leaves that mysteriously disappeared. None of these claims could be verified, but together they created a heavy cloud of uncertainty around the manuscript's reconstruction. That cloud thickened when early photographs came under scrutiny. Scholars comparing images from the 1980s with the restored codex noticed inconsistencies, missing letters, altered edges, and one page that didn't correspond to any surviving fragment. These discrepancies didn't prove manipulation, they proved fragility. Dealers may have rearranged pages to make the codex appear more complete. Owners may have shuffled leaves while examining them, and each untrained hand left behind flakes of ink that could never be retrieved. At this point it becomes clear why the reconstruction turned into a battleground. Everyone understood the manuscript's historical importance. Everyone also knew its narrative. Elevating Judas to a role more complex than tradition allows would attract worldwide attention the moment it was published. Control over restoration meant control over interpretation. Control over interpretation meant shaping the public story, and control over fragments meant the possibility of discovering missing passages no one else possessed. Competition naturally bred suspicion. Some scholars believed collectors were holding fragments back intentionally, waiting for their value to rise once the Gospel was published. Others thought translators were softening controversial passages to create a more stable narrative. A few argued that the publicity machine built around the publication obscured the manuscript's severely damaged state, raising expectations the text could never satisfy. The codex's physical fragility became a metaphor for its conceptual fragility. Everyone wanted a clear story, but the manuscript offered only shards. The most unsettling realization, however, was that certain pages had genuinely vanished. Conservators acknowledged gaps matching pages visible in older photos, but absent in the restored sequence. Dealers quietly admitted they had once seen fragments that no longer existed. Scholars involved in early negotiations remembered leaves shown to them that never appeared in any conservation lab. This was not a tale of a single saboteur. It was the accumulated result of decades of carelessness, secrecy, and opportunism. The codex had been injured by many hands. Stepping back, a pattern emerges. Every actor, collectors, scholars, dealers, foundations, believed they were protecting or interpreting the text correctly, yet their competing impulses fractured the gospel as surely as mishandling fractured its pages. Each attempt to stabilize the narrative reopened uncertainty. The Gospel of Judas became a mirror, reflecting the contradictory instincts of everyone who touched it: the desire to reveal, the instinct to control, the fear of misinterpretation, the belief that only one's approach would safeguard the truth. And when you follow this chain to its end, one question begins to overshadow the entire restoration. What did the missing fragments contain? Scholars can infer possibilities: more dialogue between Jesus and Judas, additional cosmic imagery, perhaps clarifications of Judas's role. But those gaps form a perimeter of unknowns, and in that empty space speculation grows. The gospel we possess is powerful enough. The gospel as it originally existed might have been even more disruptive. It's that sense of incompleteness, of crucial pieces, lost through negligence, competition, or secrecy, that pushes the story toward its final revelation, because the fragments that survived still carry an idea so radical that even in their damaged state they force a rethinking of one of Christianity's deepest assumptions. The shock isn't what the missing pages might have said, it's what the remaining ones dared to say. By the time you reach the final surviving passages of the Codex, the disputes, the missing fragments, and the decades of mishandling fall away. What matters now is what remains, what the text still manages to say despite every wound it endured. And as these reconstructed lines gather toward their conclusion, you begin to understand why this gospel provoked such caution, unease, and fascination. The danger was never the object, it was the idea. The gospel does not dwell on the physical suffering that later defined the passion narratives. Instead, Jesus appears as someone fully aware of the divide between the divine and the material, a figure navigating layers of existence and preparing to shed the physical form. Scholars of Gnostic literature recognize the structure immediately, the body as a temporary garment, the spirit as eternal, and salvation not through endurance of the flesh, but through transcendence. In that worldview, the events leading to the crucifixion are not tragedy, they are transition. Within that framework, Judas's role becomes almost inevitable. The text does not portray him as a faltering disciple. It presents him as the one capable of understanding what must occur for Jesus to complete his passage out of the human realm. Their exchange carries no sense of conspiracy or emotional fracture, only solemn necessity. Jesus speaks to Judas as someone who sees the architecture beneath events, someone who is not bound by the fear or misunderstanding that limits the others. This becomes clearest in the lines where Jesus speaks of his physical body. He describes it as a vessel to be discarded, a form whose abandonment enables return to the realm of light. When Judas accepts this, the moment reads not as betrayal, but as recognition. The decisive act handing Jesus over functions not as collapse, but as insight made real. And it is this reinterpretation that reverberates most sharply against the canonical story, familiar to believers. You can see why this unsettles traditions built around the stark divide between loyalty and treachery. If the pivotal act of the Passion is obedience rather than betrayal, then the emotional framework that shapes Christian memory begins to shift. Judas ceases to be the emblem of failure. He becomes the one who shoulders the most difficult role, not out of greed, but out of comprehension. And when that role changes, the meanings attached to sacrifice, guilt, redemption, and divine intention bend with it. The shift doesn't erase the canonical narrative. It simply reveals a competing vision that once circulated in early Christianity. In the 2nd century, followers of Jesus interpreted his death through many lenses: martyrdom, mystical ascent, ethical transformation. The Gospel of Judas belongs to the current that viewed salvation as awakening to knowledge, a view in which Judas's action becomes alignment with truth rather than a fall from grace. The diversity itself is not surprising. The sharpness of this particular reversal, what stands out in the Gospel's final tone, is its quiet gravity. Unlike other apocryphal texts that end in triumph or catastrophe, this one leaves you in a space where understanding is both illumination and burden. Judas knows what the others cannot, and that insight isolates him. Jesus affirms his role, but also tells him he will be cursed by future generations. The line, though fragmentary, carries a haunting clarity. The text acknowledges the very narrative that will erase its own. It foresees Judas's transformation into a villain and accepts it as the cost of fulfilling the design. That detail deepens the impact. It hints that betrayal and condemnation were surface readings, responses from a community unable to perceive the underlying logic. Beneath them lies a story about destiny, knowledge, and the loneliness of bearing a truth others are not prepared to face. Judas does not escape judgment within the Gospel's universe. He absorbs it knowingly. His act is necessary and tragic, not because it violates loyalty, but because it aligns him with a truth most would refuse. This tension, recognition met with rejection, gives the ending its solemn, almost prophetic weight. The implications ripple outward. If divine purpose includes roles that appear as failure from the outside, then morality becomes more complex. If insight isolates rather than elevates, then understanding itself becomes a burden. And if salvation requires someone to take on the role of the condemned, then the community's judgment becomes part of the design, not a verdict on truth. These ideas sit uneasily beside the shared narratives that shaped mainstream Christian identity, narratives built on collective memory, collective guilt, and collective redemption. That is why the gospel still feels dangerous, not because it threatens doctrine directly, but because it complicates the emotional simplicity that communities rely on. Traditions often depend on clear categories: hero, villain, loyal, traitor. The Gospel of Judas removes the villain without offering a replacement. It asks the reader to re-examine what betrayal means, what obedience means, and what it cost to bear a role history will condemn. These questions do not overturn theology, but they unsettle the instincts shaped by centuries of storytelling. And in that instability lies the manuscript's power. Its strength is not in completeness, because it survives only in fragments, but in its refusal to follow the familiar moral script. It offers a world governed by hidden logic, rare insight, and a figure cast as a betrayer who instead understands what must be done. It doesn't cancel the canonical story. It stands beside it, a reminder that Christian memory was never singular, and that meaning was contested long before narratives became fixed. Perhaps that is why the gospel was met with caution, indifference, or resistance throughout its long journey, not because it promised scandal, but because it demanded reconsideration. It asked readers to look at one of the most emotionally charged figures in Christianity and see not a villain, but a participant in a larger mystery. And once a story invites you to shift your categories, it becomes nearly impossible to return to the clarity you thought you knew. The manuscript ends in fragments, but the idea survives intact. If Judas was not the traitor, then the story inherited by centuries of believers is not the only way to understand what happened. And once that possibility exists, the familiar account begins to change, subtly, irrevocably, echoing far beyond the brittle edges of the surviving pages. In the end, the Gospel of Judas survives only as fragments, fragile, incomplete, and scarred, but its idea remains whole. If Judas was not the traitor, then the story we inherited is only one version of what happened. And once that possibility opens, the past stops being fixed and becomes something far more unsettling, a mystery still capable of rewriting the way we remember everything.